Postman is an incredible tool for testing APIs. You can make GET and POST requests. You can even add in different query params. So for example, post ID 2, click send. It's going to give you detailed information about the request, status, time it took, and the size of the response. But you don't need Postman at all. Instead, you can create your very own version of Postman that does the exact same thing. As you can clearly see, when we click send, it gives us the exact same set of results down here. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now to get started with building this Postman clone, the very first thing we need to do is actually get npm set up because we're going to be using node modules for this. So we can just come in here and type in npm init-y, and this is going to initialize just a default package JSON for us, as you can see here. And then we need to install a few dependencies. The first dependency we're going to need is Axios, which is going to allow us to make all of our different API requests. And then we're going to install a dev dependency, and this one is going to be called Snowpack. This is just going to allow us to bundle up all of our different node modules into our actual JavaScript code and deploy it so we can use it inside of a production application, and so we can have hot module reloading and all those other nice features. Now, once that finishes installing, what we're going to need to do is add a start script in here. So we can just say start. And to run this start script, all we need to do is say snowpack dev, and that's going to start up a development version of our application. Then what we need to do is install our last package here. And this is just going to be the Bootstrap package, and that's so that we can actually do all the styles you see on the right here. They're all done entirely in Bootstrap. Now to get started, the very first thing I want to do is to create our indexed HTML page, and this is just going to be for all of the HTML you see over here for our form at the top of our page. We're not going to worry about the response section just yet. So let's get our boilerplate code here, and the first thing that we need to do inside of our body here is to actually create a div, and this div is just going to have a class of p4, and this is just to give our elements some spacing. As you can see, we have a pretty large amount of spacing all around everything, so this p4 is going to give us all that spacing. And you'll notice we're not actually importing Bootstrap inside of our HTML. Instead, we're going to import our script tag, which is going to have a source of script.js, and we're going to defer this script tag, and actually instead of defer, we're going to make sure we say the type is modular, since we're using modules. And then we're going to create that script.js file. And inside here is where we're actually going to import Bootstrap. So we can just say import Bootstrap. And we also need to make sure that we import the CSS. So we're going to import bootstrap/dist/css. And this is called bootstrap.min.css. This is going to give us our JavaScript and our CSS for Bootstrap. And now what we can do, if we just actually run this by saying npm start, and we actually go to the URL this gives us. So if we just give it a second, it should open up on the side of our screen at the correct URL, as you can see, just like that. And if we put some content inside of here and click save, you can see we have that nice amount of padding around here, so we know Bootstrap is working. Now let's just go back to the example we're working off of. And the very first thing I want to do inside of here is to create our form. And inside of this form, the first thing I want to do is create this input up here that allows us to select whether we want to make get, post, put, patch, or delete, type in the URL, and then click our send button. So inside of here, we're going to have an input group. So we can have a div, which is going to have a class of input group, and we want the margin on the bottom to be 4. That's just going to give us some spacing between our input up here and then our form down here with all these different tabs. The next thing I want to do is to create our select box. So we're going to create a select. We're just going to give it here a class of form select. That's going to give it some Bootstrap styling. We also want to make sure that this doesn't grow in size. So we're going to give it a flex grow of 0. And a width of auto, just so it's going to be the smallest size possible. And inside of here, we need to put all of our different options. So our options here that we're going to have is going to be get, and it's going to have a value which is get. And I'm just going to copy this down a couple times. I want to make sure that this get is selected by default. So we're going to have a get, we're going to have a post here, we're going to have a put. Then down here, what we're going to do is we're going to have a patch, and we're going to have a delete. And now if we save and come over here, you can see we now have that nice drop down that has our get, post, put, patch, and delete. The next thing we need to do is our actual input for our text selection. So let's create an input here. We want to make sure that this input is required. And we're going to give it a class of form control. And if we just save real quick to see what that looks like, we can see that we have an input here, but there's a few extra parameters I want to add into this. First of all, I want to specify the type is a URL, since we're going to be putting URLs in here. And I want to make sure the placeholder for this is just going to be an example URL. So we can just say https example.com, just like that. Then finally, we are going to need our button that closes this off. And this is going to be a submit button. And we want to make sure we give it a class of button. and button primary, which is going to give it the blue color. And we can put the text send inside of here. So now we have this nice section at the top of our form completely done. The next section is going to be these tabs right here, and they're going to be inside of our form still because these are all going to be form elements we submit with our form. So the way tabs work in Bootstrap are a little interesting. First, you're going to create a list essentially that's going to have all of your different tabs. And this list is going to have a class on it, which is nav and nav tabs, so we know this is a tab. And we're also going to give it a role of tab list just so that screen readers are going to know this is a tab list. And inside of here, we want a bunch of list items that contain all of our tabs. And we want to make sure we say that these are nav items since they're in our list. And the role here is going to be for presentation because it's going to change the presentation. Then we're going to have a button for each one of our different tabs. And the text inside of here, we're going to have query params as the first one. And then we need to add a bunch of data attributes onto this to make the tabs actually allow us to switch between different pieces of content. So let's just do that real quick. First, we're going to add our classes for styling. We're going to say that this is a nav link. And this first one is going to be active, so we're going to give it the active class. Also, we're going to give it an ID here, which is just going to say query params tab. Then what we need to do is add in all of our different data attributes. So we're going to have data bs toggle, and we're going to set this to tab, saying that this is a toggle for tabs. Then we're going to have the data bs target, and this is going to be the ID of the thing that we're going to be targeting. So we're going to create an element with the ID of query params, and that's going to be where our content for our query parameters goes. That's going to be something we create after we get all of these different tabs done. Then we're just going to make sure we give it a type of button. We're also going to make sure that we give it a role of tab. That's just again for screen readers. And area controls, again, this is another thing for screen readers. We're going to set this to query params because this is going to be controlling the element with the ID of query params. Finally, we're going to set our area selected here equal to true. And that's all we need for this tab. And if we save, we come over here, you can see we have that tab, just has no content inside of it because we have no content yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this down for another tab, and this tab right here is not going to be active, so we're going to remove the active class for it, and this one's going to be for our request headers. So I'm going to say request headers. And we're just going to copy this down because we're going to use this in a lot of places. So here, instead of query params, this is going to be request headers for both of those sections, and right here, we're going to change this to request headers. And then it's not selected, so we're going to set the area selected to false. And here I'm just going to say headers instead of request headers. So now if we come over here, you can see we have that tab done. And the last tab is going to be our JSON tab, which is very similar to this. And we're just going to change all of this essentially from request headers, and we're going to change it to JSON. So it's going to be JSON tab. We're going to have the JSON here and JSON here and JSON here. Now, once that's done, we can kind of minimize this down and actually work on the content for our tabs instead. So we can create another div. And this div needs to have a class, which is tab content. And we're just going to give it some spacing. So we're going to say P3, and we're going to put a border on the top, which is 0, and a border. So what this is going to do is allow us to have this nice border around our entire thing, but we're not going to put a border on the top because our tabs already have a border on the top themselves. So now if we just save this on its own, you can see we have a content right here that has a border all the way around it for each one of these, but obviously there's nothing inside of this content. So we need different divs to do that. And these divs are all going to be tab panes. So we're going to give them a class of tab pane, a class of fade, a class of show, and active. And that's because this is our active tab, our very first tab. And we're going to link up our ID. So inside of our tab, if you look here, you remember we gave this an ID of query params for the target. Well, what we need to do is make sure that our ID of the thing we want to show has the exact same ID, query params. Also, what we're going to do is give it a role, and this role is just tab panel, again for screen readers, and area labeled by, and we're going to give this the ID of query params tab. And that's just the ID of the label that we want to use, which is query params in our case. Now inside of here, we want to put all of the content for our query parameters. So if we just look what this looks like, as you can see, it's just an input for a key value pair, as well as a remove button and an add button. So first we want to create a div. And this div right now, we're actually going to leave empty. This is where these key value pairs are going to go, but we're going to automatically make these populated here using this add button. So we want to make sure that we actually leave this empty and let the JavaScript handle populating that. So let's actually just for now give this a data attribute called query params, so we know that this is where we're going to add our query parameters. Also, we want to add that button, and this is going to be for adding query params. So we'll give it a query param button data attribute here. And then we're going to say the class on this is going to be margin top of 2, button, and button outline success. That's going to give it that green color. And we're also going to make sure here that the type is button, just so it doesn't submit our form. And let's just put the text add inside of there. And as you can see, now we have that add button, and obviously it doesn't do anything yet, but that's perfectly okay. For our headers, we want to do essentially the exact same thing. Let me just copy this div down, paste it, and this one, instead of query params, is going to be for our request headers. So this is going to say request headers. I'm just going to copy this into all the places where we have query params, just like this, and right here. And here I'll just make sure this says request header instead of request headers because we're only going to add one. And now just to make this work, let's get rid of that show and active class because obviously this one is not active right away. And as you can see, we have the add button. When we click headers, it fades out to the add button for headers. And if we just say like add to here, we can really see the difference. As you can see, it says add to when we click headers, and it stays with add when we click over here. And the last thing to do is this JSON section, which we don't have a div for yet. What I'm going to do is essentially just copy this div down, paste it here, and this one is going to be for JSON. So we're going to give it an ID of JSON. It's going to say JSON here, and it's going to be a little bit different on the internals. So we can kind of delete this, and the internals of this are just going to be a single div. And that's because we're going to be using a library to change this div into a fancy text edit field. Because as you can see over here, we have this really fancy text editor, and we're going to convert this div to this fancy text editor. So let's give it a data attribute so we can select it, and we're just going to call it data JSON request body. We're going to give it a class of overflow auto so that it is able to scroll. And to make sure we limit the height of this, we're going to set the max height here to 200 pixels. That just makes it so it's not going to get too large on our screen. So with that done, we can now save. And you'll notice when we click on our JSON tab, it pretty much looks empty, but that's because we don't have the JavaScript hooked up to actually make this into a text input. And the last thing I want to do inside of our HTML before we move on to our JavaScript is to create a template. And this template is going to be for each one of the add query params here. So each time of these key value pairs, we're going to create inside this template, and we're just going to call this data key value template. That way we can select this inside of our JavaScript. There we go. And inside of here, we're essentially going to have a div, and this div is going to be for an input group. And we're going to give it a little margin on the top so that it's got some spacing. And we're going to say data key value pair, so we can again select this in JavaScript. Now inside of here, we need an input for our key, our value, and our remove button. So we're going to have an input with the type of text. We're going to give it also a data attribute of key, so we know this is for our key. We're going to give it a class, which is just going to be form control, so it's going to have bootstrap styling. And we're going to give it a placeholder which says key. And we'll close that off. And we're just going to copy this down one more time. And this is going to be for our value. So it's going to be a data value, and the placeholder is value. And then finally, we're going to have a button down here. Oops, make sure we have this on a new line, which is going to have a type of button. It's going to say data remove button. So we know this is for removing our query parameter. And the class here is going to be button and button outline danger. So it's going to give that red color, and we'll just say remove. So now we won't see this on our screen anywhere, but if we just copy this code for now to kind of see what it would look like, and we put it inside of our query param section, you can see this is what our key value pair is going to look like. But again, like I said, we want to handle all of this in JavaScript, which is why I'm putting it inside of a template down here. So now let's move into our JavaScript. And the first thing I want to do is just select the sections where we're going to add in those key value pairs. So we have a const here for query params container. And this is just document.querySelector. And we called this data query params. I'm going to copy this down because we're going to do essentially the exact same thing, but for our request headers container. And instead of query params here, this is request headers. Then what I want to do is I just want to append on a new key value pair. So query params container dot append. We want to create a key value pair. That's going to be a function we're going to create. I want to do the exact same thing for our request headers. So now let's create that function that allows us to create a key value pair. Create key value pair. And inside this function, I want to get an element, and that element is going to be from our document.querySelector. We want to query select that template. So let's see what we called that template, our data key value template. Just going to copy that over here. We want to get the content from this, and then we want to clone the node with true passed in, so it's going to get all of the children element. And just to make this a little easier, I'm going to extract this out into a variable. We're just going to call this here key value template. And it's just going to make our code a little easier to read. So now we have our element, and I want to take our element, and I want to query select our element to get to that button, so our data remove button. And I want to set up an event listener on this. So we're going to add an event listener, and it's going to be for on click. And whenever we click on this, I just want to remove this element. So what we can do is we can take an e here, and we can just say e.target.closest and I want to get the closest data key value pair. And that's because if we look inside of our template, you can see that that is the data attribute we gave to everything inside of our template. So essentially, we're going to be selecting the entire element. And what I want to do is just remove it. So we're going to remove the entire thing if we click on that remove button. And down here, I just want to make sure we return the element. And that way, we can actually make sure we add it right here. So now we're actually adding these things to our container, but you'll notice it's not quite working. There's nothing inside of our containers. So let's see if we have an error. If we inspect our page real quick, and we go to our console, it looks like we have an error. Key value template, text content, clone node is not a function. And that's because instead of saying text content here, this should just say content. So now if we save, you can see we have a key value pair being added. And if we click remove, it is removing them. But this add button currently doesn't do anything yet. In order to make that work, let's just come down here and we're going to say that we want to do a document.query selector. We want a query selector for the data add query param button. That's what we gave the class for this button right here. That's the query param. And I want to add an event listener for whenever we click on that button, just like this. So if I say that real quick, you can see we have this function here. And in this function, I just want to take our query params container and I want to append to it that create key value pair. So now if I click add, you can see it's constantly adding key value pairs and we can remove them. So this is really working as we expect. If I copy this and paste it down, we can do the exact same thing, but this is going to be for adding a request header. And I want to do it inside of our request headers container, just like that. Now add works here. We come over here, we can click add here. We can remove all these. And over here, we can remove all these. So all of that is working as expected. So now that we have the ability to add query params, add headers, add a URL, and change what we're doing as well as sending it, let's actually hook up and make these requests before we worry about sending along JSON, just so we can see if our GET requests work. And to do that, we're going to be using Axios. So I just want to make sure we install Axios. That way we can use it. And way at the top here, we're going to import Axios from Axios, just like that. And the next thing I want to do is I want to select our form. So we can say const form, and that's just document.query selector. And we'll just give it a data attribute of data form. And if we go into our index.html, scroll up all the way to where our form is, right here, we can say data form. Also for this form, we're going to need to be able to get access to this select here. So we can give this a data method because this is the method we're going to be using. And our input here should say data URL, since this is going to be the URL that we're using. That way we can access all of these inside of our JavaScript. Now with that done, we can go back into our script.js and let's set up an event listener for our form. So we can say form.addEventListener, and this is going to be for submit. We're going to take an event. And the first thing I obviously want to do is prevent the default. So we're going to say e.preventDefault. And then what I want to do is actually make an Axios request. So I'm going to say Axios, and this Axios function is going to take a bunch of parameters. We're going to have a URL, which is just document.querySelector, and we're going to get the parameter for data URL, and we want to get the value from that. That's going to be our URL from up here. Then we can get our method, which again is coming from document.querySelector, data method, that's our select, and we just want to get the value from our select. So we can say .value. Then we're going to get our params, and we're also going to get our headers. That's going to be the things for our query params and our headers. And to get these, we're actually going to create a function that's going to convert our key value pairs to actual objects that we can pass along. Because the way that Axios works is you need to pass it an object that has a key, which will be our key here, and a value, which will be our value here. So we need to convert from this HTML representation to a JavaScript representation. And we're going to pass it the container for our different query parameters. This is going to be called query params container. And for our headers, we're going to do the exact same thing, but this is going to be for our request headers container. So let's create that function now. We can just say function key value pairs to objects, and this is going to take in a container. So what we're going to do is we just want to get all of our pairs. So we're going to call this pairs, which is just equal to our container.querySelector all. And we want to get everything that is a data key value pair, because that is the selector that we gave to our entire thing for the key value pair. Then what I want to do is I want to convert these pairs to an array, because by default, they're not an array, they're a weird node list. So we can use the reduce method on it once we convert it to an array. And we're going to take our data object and each one of the pairs. And by default, we want our data object to just be an empty object. So now we have all of our different pairs. We're going to be reducing these pairs with this data object here. Also, I want to make sure that we return this value, since this is the thing we want to get. This is going to be the object we convert our pairs into. So what I want to do is I want to get the key. The key is just pair.querySelector of data key. That's the selector we gave it. And we just want to get the value. Then for our value, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take our data value and we're going to get the value from it. Then what we can do is we can essentially say, hey, if our key is equal to an empty string, well, that just means they didn't actually put in a key. So we're just going to return the data as is. This just means they left this blank. Otherwise, if we do have a key, then we want to take our data, spread it out. So we want all of our current data, and we want to add in a new key value pair for that data. So we're going to take our key value pair if it exists and add it into our object on top of the data we already have. So now with all of that done, we should be able to actually make an Axios request just like this. And to see if that works, we're just going to put a dot then here, which gets our response. And what I'm going to do for now is just console.log our response. Now to see if this works, we're going to be using the JSON placeholder API. So let's just copy in the URL here that's in the example, and we're going to paste it in here and click send. And hopefully if we check our console, inside of our console, you can see we have an object, which is all of our information, including the data that's being returned to us. But we also have our headers and additional information we're going to need for printing out everything for Postman. Also, you can check in our network. And if we just make that request one more time, you can see it show up here along with all of the additional information about this request that we need, such as things like the response headers and the request headers. And if we pass in a param, for example, a param like this, and we click send, you can now see we have a new request right here, and you can see it has query string parameters at the bottom for the correct parameters that we passed. And we can even go into the headers. We could create a header like this, make another request, and if we click on that and we click on the request headers here, go to the bottom, you can see that request header we created is being passed along. So all the information in our form is being properly passed along. So this is working as we expect. Now all we need to do is actually make sure that we can actually render out the results to us, because right now we can't actually see any of the results. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually create our HTML. And our HTML for that is going to be inside of this div, but outside of the form. We're going to create another div. This one's going to have a class of mt5 because it's going to have some margin on the top. And we're going to have the class of dnone because it's going to be hidden by default. But for now, I'm going to get rid of that class and add it later just so we can see what we're working on. I'm also going to give it a data attribute here of response section just so we can select this inside of our JavaScript. Then what I want to do is create a nice h3 that just says response. And if we save, you can see we have our response showing up down here. Now with that done, let's add all of the different status things in. So if we come over here and we just make a request real quick, we can just copy over this URL, paste it into this example, click send. You can see down here, we have a status, a time, and a size. We want to make sure we include all of that. So inside of here, let's create a div, which is going to have a class of dflex, as well as my2 to give it a little spacing. And what we want to do is have a bunch of divs for each section. So the first div here, we're going to give a class of me3 for margin on the right-hand side. And inside, we want it to just say status. And then in a span, we're going to have a data status, which is where we're going to place our status, for example, 200. And if we save, come over here, you can see that status shows up. For now, we're going to leave this blank because we're going to populate that with JavaScript. Let's just copy this down because we're going to have the exact same thing for our time. This is going to say data time. This is going to be in milliseconds. Then what we're going to do is copy this down again. And this one is going to be for size. And this is going to say data size. And we don't need to worry about this ms at the end because we're going to automatically populate the correct size, whether it's bytes or kilobytes and so on. Now, just like we had up above here, we need to have some nav tabs and tab content. So I'm actually going to copy this entire section, minimize this down, and bring it into here. So let's just minimize this. And right below it, we're going to have both our tab items right here and our tab content. And for our tab items, if we come over here, all we really care about is body and our headers. So let's just get rid of this third option because we don't need it. And the first thing that we're going to have is our body. So instead of query params, this is going to say body. I just want to make sure I copy that to every place that says query params. And also I want to change this to body. Then the next thing that we're going to have is our headers. So instead of request headers, we want our response headers. And I'm just going to replace the word request with response everywhere, just like that. And then down here, let's just get rid of this middle option since we don't need it. So all we have is the first and the third option. And again, I want to replace the word query params here with body. I'm going to do that everywhere I say query params. Just going to replace it with the word body. And we just don't really need to worry about this content inside of here at all because the content is going to be very different. So we're just going to get rid of all of this content inside of here and leave this blank for now. Then down here, again, I need to do the exact same thing for this JSON section. I need it to say response headers. And let's just copy that and replace JSON with response headers each time. And the content inside of here, we can actually copy up into our body because our body is essentially going to be a text input just like this. So we can have that inside of here. This is going to say JSON response body instead of request body. Now inside of our response section, what we need to do is have a div. And this div is going to have some custom styling because we're going to use a display of grid. And also I want to make sure our grid template columns here is just going to be auto and 1FR. And then finally, I'm going to put in a gap here of 5 REM and 2 REM just to give us plenty of space in between our different items. And then we can make sure we give this a data response headers data attribute just so we can select it inside of our JavaScript. And this styling is just going to make it so that we have our labels on the left and our values over here on the right with plenty of spacing between them. Now, if we just come over to our document, you can see that we have our response section with our headers and our body. Right now they're empty, as well as our status, time, and size. So the final thing that I want to do is just to make sure to hide all of this by default. So we're going to say D none, and it's just going to hide all of that. Into our script, instead of just console logging a response, we can actually do a lot of work to display this section on the bottom and actually populate it with the information we care about. So let's take our document.query selector, and we want to get that data response section. And what I want to do is I just want to show it. So we're going to take the class list and we're going to remove the D none class. So that way when we make a response, if we just make a response here to this URL, click send, you can see it shows this response section down here, which is exactly what we want. Then I essentially want to do 3 different things. I want to update the response details with our response. That's going to be things like our status, our time, and our size. I also want to update our response editor, which is just going to be our body down here. That's that text editor kind of view. As you can see right here, we have this like text editor I want to update, and this is going to take in our data. And then the final thing I want to do is update our response headers. This is going to take in our response.headers. So the easiest of these to do is the headers. So I'm going to comment out these other 2 for now. We're going to create a function called update response headers, which is going to take in our headers. And the very first thing I want to do is I want to take our response headers container, and I want to take the inner HTML and set it to an empty string. Essentially, this entire container I want to empty out. And right now we don't have any selector for this. So at the very top of our page, let's just come in here. We're going to have a response headers container, and this response headers container has a query selector, which is data response headers, just like that. Now we can go back down to where we were working, and what I want to do is I want to take each header and I want to loop through it. So in an object, we can say object.entries, and this will allow us to actually get an array of all of our different key value pairs. We can loop through each one of them. So we're going to have a key and a value. Make sure that's a comma here. And we're going to loop through all of these. And what I want to do is I want to create a key element, which is just going to be a div. So we're going to say document.create element of a div. And I'm going to take our key element dot text content, set it to our key value. And then I want to append this to our response headers container. So I'm going to append our key. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Make sure this key element, the exact same thing here for our value. So we're going to have a value element, and let's just copy this down, because this here will say value element, and this will be set to our value. This is going to update our response headers. So hopefully if we make a request to this API, click send, you can see in our header section, we have all of our different headers being shown to us, but clearly there's way too much spacing between them right now. So if I go into our index HTML and I scroll down to where we have our spacing, let's change this to 0.5 REM instead. And now hopefully if we make our request and we go to our headers, you can see this spacing is much better. I just had it way too large. And the next thing that I want to work on inside of here, if we just scroll up, is going to be for our response details. So let's create a simple function called update response details, which takes in our response. And essentially we have 3 different sections. We have a document query selector for our status. And all I want to do is just take the text content of this. So .text content and set it to response.status. That's super straightforward. And if I save and I again make this request, click send, you can see our status has been set to 200. But if I look for something that doesn't exist, you can see we're going to get a different status. We actually notice we don't get another status. And that's because when Axios makes a failed request, if we go find Axios, it's going to call our .catch. What we want to do instead is take our .catch and we just want to get our error and we just want to return our error. And the reason we're doing this is so that anytime we are catching an error, we just want the error to continue going forward as if it was a normal response, because we're going to have a status on our response error. So now if we save and we go ahead and make this request that's successful, you see it works, and unsuccessfully, you're going to see that it doesn't work, and we're not going to have a status or anything down here. Now this still doesn't work because the error doesn't quite look exactly like a response, but we can actually kind of trick Axios into working how we want it to. And in doing so, we're also going to fix the problem where we can get how long the Axios request takes. So what I want to do is I want to set up an interceptor. So we can say axios.interceptors, and whenever we have a request, we want to intercept that request by using this function, which is going to take in our request. And all I want to do is I want to take the request and I want to set some custom data on it, which is just going to be request.customData, or we're going to default it to an empty object. So if we already have custom data, I don't want to overwrite it. I'm just going to use this empty object. Then we're going to take our custom data and we're going to set a start time, which is equal to just the current time. So we're going to say new date.getTime. That's just the current timestamp. And we turn our current request. So whenever we make a request, we're going to set a start time equal to our current time. Then what we're going to do is essentially intercept when that response comes in. So we're going to say axios.interceptors.response, again, .use. And what we want to do here is when we have a successful response, we want to call a function. And when we have an error, we want to call a different function. So on success, we're going to say update and time is the function we're going to call. And on error, what I want to do is I want to take a promise, I want to reject it. I'm going to call this same update response thing. So we're going to say update end time with e.response. In this function, all we're going to do is update the end time so we can actually figure out how long a request took. And we're going to do it whether we have a success or whether we have an error. And we can pass in the e.response. That'd be the same thing as if we did e.response down here. That would actually make our code work if we got rid of these interceptors. I can show you real quick. Get rid of these interceptors, and we just make the request to this URL. That works. And then if we go to -1, you can see our status is 404. That's just because we're getting the response from our error. But instead, what we want to do is just get the actual error object and pass it through. And that's because in our interceptor, we're going to be taking care of getting our response and passing it through as we expect. So instead of actually having an error here, it's going to just be a response object, but it's going to be coming from our .catch. And we're just returning that. That way we can handle it in our .then down here. So with all that said, let's actually create that function. This function is just called update end time, which takes in a response. And inside of here, what I want to do is I want to take our custom data. So we can have custom data for our response. And I, again, just want to default this here, response.customData to an empty object. So it'll either be itself or an empty object. And the reason we're doing this is because this response is different than the request up here. So we have a response object with custom data and a request with custom data. Then I want to set the time on here. So we'll say request.customData.time. And I just want to take the current time. So we'll say new date.getTime. And I'll subtract it from the time that we set up here in our interceptor. So we can say response.config, and that'll actually give us our request. And then we can say customData.startTime. And then finally, I want to return our response. So all we're doing here is defaulting some custom data, setting the time in it equal to the difference between our current time and the time when our response actually started, or our request started. So that's going to give us our time. And then what we can do here is just do a query selector for our data time. We can set the text content to response.time, and that's actually custom data.time. So now if we just make the request, we paste this, click send, you can see it took 31 milliseconds. Let's say we make an error request, click send, and it looks like that didn't work. If we just scroll up here a little ways, it's because I forgot to return this promise right here. So now if we paste this in, click send, it works successfully. -1, click send, we again get our 404, and our time is being different every time because it determines how long our actual request takes. Our time is being dynamically determined. Next, we have our size, and to make it easier to calculate our size, we're going to use a library here called npmi pretty bytes. This is just going to allow us to give it a number, and it's going to convert it to a byte value that's either going to be byte, kilobyte, megabyte, and so on. Let's just make sure up here we import pretty bytes from pretty bytes. And then way down at the bottom here, we're going to just have document.query selector. We want to query selector our size, so our data size. We want to set the text content equal to calling that pretty bytes function. And inside of here, we just need to pass it the information. So this is just going to be a number of bytes that we have. And to get our bytes, we're just going to take our JSON, we're going to stringify our response.data, and we're going to add to that the stringified JSON for our response.headers. That's all the information that's passed down. And what we need to do is get the length of this. The length is going to give us the number of bytes because one character in a string is the same as 1 byte. So this is going to give us the number of bytes. Same thing here. And now if we save and we make a request to this URL, paste it in here, click send, you can see it's 183 bytes to get this. Or if we get all the to-dos and click send, you can see that's 18.4 kilobytes because it's a much larger response. And this isn't 100% totally accurate, but it's going to be accurate enough for our use case. Now the final thing we have left is going to be our text editors for our JSON and our body, so we can actually render out and type in JSON information. And in order to do this, we're going to be using a library called CodeMirror. So we need to install a bunch of packages from @CodeMirror. And the first package is called basic setup. Then we're going to need another package from CodeMirror, and this one's going to be called view. Then another one from @CodeMirror, and this one's called commands. And then finally, one last from CodeMirror. Make sure I spell that properly. This one's called lang JSON, since all of our code is going to be in JSON. And with this done, what I'm going to do is actually create a brand new file, and this file is going to be called setup.editor.js because we want to encapsulate all of our editor code into this one single file. And in here, I'm going to import everything we're going to need from CodeMirror. I'm going to import editor state and basic setup, and that's going to come from @CodeMirror/basic setup. And then before we start importing anything else, I just want to kind of get our functions ready. So the first function we're going to have is an export default function for setting up our editors. So we're going to call this setup editors. And what this is going to do is going to get our actual elements, which are the divs we created. And if you remember, we can call these JSON request body, and that is just our document.query selector. And we give this a data JSON request body data attribute. We can do the exact same thing for our response body, and this is just response instead of request here. And then we actually need to set these up. So the way that CodeMirror works is you need to create an editor view. So let's make sure we import editor view. We're also going to import key map while we're at it, because we're going to need that as well. And this comes from that view library, so @CodeMirror/view. So in order to set up the editor, we can just essentially say that we want to create a request editor, and this is going to be equal to a new editor view. And this new editor view is going to take in a state, which is like what the information in our editor is, and it's going to take in a parent, which is just the element we attach this to. So we're going to call this our JSON request body. That's where we're going to attach this to. And in our state, what we need to do is to create a brand new state. So we're going to say editor state.create. And of course, we need to make sure we have editor state, which is imported up here. And inside of here, we're going to pass it doc. The doc is like the text content, and our request is by default going to be an opening and closing curly bracket. And then we want to make sure we have a new line, a tab, and a new line inside of here, just so we can immediately start typing inside of this thing. And then we're going to need to have some extensions. And extensions are like the bread and butter of how exactly your entire editor works. So what we're going to do is create a variable called basic extensions. And this is going to be the extensions that both of our editors share. So we can set this to a new array. And the first extension we want is basic setup. That does all the work for like 95% of your setup stuff. And then what we need to do is set up a function for keymap. And we can say keymap.of, and we want to keymap the default tab binding. And this is imported from the CodeMirror commands. All that this does is allow us to use tab inside of the text editor. Instead of tabbing to the new input, it'll stay inside the text editor and insert two spaces. And in order to tell it what language we're using, we can use the function called JSON, which we're going to import this JSON function from, and we want to get it from CodeMirror/lang-JSON. Then the last thing that we need to do is set up our tab spacing. So we can say editor.state.tabsize.of2. This just says that we're going to have 2 spaces for every single tab. Then we can take those extensions and pass them right into here. And finally, let's just return our request editor from here. So that's going to be what our request editor is like. Let's do our response editor next. It's almost exactly the same. So we're going to have a response editor here. It's going to be our JSON response body. Our doc by default is just going to be essentially an empty JavaScript object. And we also want to make sure we add an additional extension on here. So we're going to have our basic extensions. But we're also going to want to make sure this is read only. So we can say editor view.editable, and we want to set the value of that to false. So essentially all we've done inside of here is just use our normal extensions, and we made sure that you cannot edit this one because this is going to be the value that gets returned, and we don't want to be able to edit that. Also, I just want to return a simple update function. So we're going to say update response editor with a value, and this update function is essentially what's going to update the content inside of our response editor. So to do that, it's a little bit confusing. We need to take our response editor, response editor, and we need to dispatch a function to it. And this dispatch is going to tell us all the changes we want to make inside of this changes object. And changes are kind of weird in the fact that what we want to do is we want to make a change by taking all the text from our document and replacing it with new text. So we can say from index 0, what we want to do is go to the final index. So we can say response editor.state.doc.length. So this is saying for the entirety of all of our document text, what I want to do is I want to make an insert command, and I want to insert the JSON stringified version of this value. And if we pass in null and 2 here, that's going to make this print out like pretty JSON, so it's going to do all the formatting for us. And all this function is doing is saying insert inside of our document, replace everything inside of it with this text right here. And I'm going to take this response update, I'm going to return it from our function here. Now the only thing left to do is to make sure we actually import this and use it. So in our script.js, let's just come in here and we're going to say import setup editor, and that's coming from /setup editor. And then way down here, before we do any of this section, you can see we have this response editor function. We can just uncomment that. And up here, we can say that our response editor and our update response editor, and this one should say request editor, is just going to be equal to calling that setup editor function. And let's just make sure this isn't setup editors, just like it is up here, setup editors. There we go. So now if we save, we hopefully should have our actual response being populated. So let's just copy this, paste it into here, click send, and you can see our response is showing up right here. And if we get all the to-dos, you can see we get a ton of information in our response, and we can't edit this. This is uneditable, which is exactly what we want. And the reason this is working is because we're calling this update response editor function here, which is just being called inside of here and updating our response editor. Now next we need to get our request editor and actually make it show up on our screen. Because as you can see here, we have it and we can type information in here, but it's not actually going to get sent along with our request. So to do that, we need to get our data. So let's create a variable called data. And then we're going to create a simple try and a catch. And inside of the catch, we're going to just catch the error. And if we have an error, we're just going to say, JSON data is malformed. And we're going to return. This just means that we couldn't figure out what your JSON data was. And what we'd want to do inside of here is try to get our data. So we're going to say json.parse. And what we want to do is parse the data from our request editor. So request editor.state.doc.toString, string, and we want to say or null. So all this is going to do is it's going to take essentially the JSON from our document and try to convert it into an object. Otherwise, it's just going to use null for the default if there's nothing inside of here. So if I just save and I go to JSON and I type in random stuff and click send, make sure that we have a URL inside of here, you're going to see it says JSON data is malformed. But if I actually put in some real JSON data, for example, this, and click send, you can see that it works. Now we just need to send our data to Axios. So we'll just say data, just like this, to send it along with our request. And what we can do is let's make a post request. And we're going to make a post request to /todos. And inside of our JSON, what we want to do is we're just going to say that we're going to give it a name, which is just hi. Now when I click send, you can see we're created a new to-do with the ID 201 and the name of hi. And if we just inspect here, go over to our network tab, and we make sure that we rerun that request, you can see if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we have a request payload, which contains that JSON that we typed in up here. And that's all it takes to create this Postman clone. If you enjoyed this video, check out my other clones over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this.